it's as predictable as night following day, isn't it? There are calls for the UK to take in refugees from Gaza. Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf led the charge with his speech to the SNP conference yesterday.
I'm calling today on the international community to commit to a worldwide refugee programme for the people of Gaza.
So, we have Egypt, Jordan and Turkey, at the latest count anyway, refusing to take in any refugees from Gaza. That was the latest that I saw. Why is that? I don't quite understand that. Those countries were very keen to show solidarity with the Palestinian people, weren't they? If neighbouring countries are not going to take their fair share, why should we? Would there need to be a global refugee system if neighbouring nations took some of those refugees? Let's get the thoughts now of Dean Thompson, who's a former lecturer and writer for Think Scotland. Thank you very much, Dean. Firstly, your view on Humza Yousaf offering up your proud nation to be a leading light in a global Gazan refugee scheme.
Well, I think a large part of this is Humza Yousaf needing to reassert domestic political momentum. He's had a very bad time of it, losing the Rutherglen by-election, Scottish Labour drawing even in the opinion polls. I think there's a lot more of what's in the best interests of Humza Yousaf with this. Motivating it is always the SNP's go-to strategy. Virtuous Holyrood under the SNP, big, nasty, regressive Westminster under the Tories. So I think there's a lot of political considerations motivating the.
Can I just ask on that, Dean? Sorry, can I just ask on that, Dean? Do you think actually that's fair for Humza Yousaf, though? I'm not sure how popular it would be to allow potentially thousands of people who may or may not have voted for a terrorist organisation in the shape of Hamas several years ago, whilst they were still having elections, who were being refused access to their neighbouring fellow Arab countries, to just be plonked in Scotland. Do you not think that that might not actually go down that well with the people of Scotland?
Well, personally speaking, I have been at the receiving end of a tremendous amount of anti-Semitic abuse over the last week or so. And I know many in the Jewish community in Scotland have as well. So it's something that does cause pause for thought. But the larger point here is, if you listen to people like the chief economist at the World Food Programme, Arif Hussein, he makes very clear in a study he conducted with the World Food Programme a couple of years ago that most refugees fleeing a war zone or conflict zone will relocate within their country 3 times before they make the decision to go abroad, because they want to be closer to home rather than furthest away. Obviously, because cultural considerations, food, habits, traditions are more familiar. So it makes, if we want to do what's best for refugees, a policy would be to keep them in the neighbourhood.
Do you not think it rings massive alarm bells that neighbouring countries don't want people from the Gaza Strip in their country?
Oh, absolutely. If countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, these are stable countries. And if, for example, we relocate refugees from Gaza to, say, Jordan or Lebanon, it is 16 times more cost effective to put them there than in Europe. So if it's a question of maximizing resources to help the refugee, it's much better to keep them in the Levant or the Maghreb rather than in Europe. So it's alarming, because what we do know is that Cairo in Egypt, they're determined to not offer any support to Palestinians in Gaza. And Jordan, likewise, Jordan's case, they've been bitten before. In years gone by, they've taken Palestinian refugees from the previous intifada. And it's been a source of political instability in Jordan for them. So I think it's a case of once bitten.
Do you not think maybe potentially the people of Scotland should also be quite concerned? I mean, last night we saw some absolutely horrific scenes at a hospital in Gaza. I was watching a Middle Eastern news outlet live when that happened. And the way that outlet decided to break the news was they were inside the hospital, they had cameras inside the hospital, and they had people dragging bodies in front of the camera, checking for pulses, looking at the camera, and saying clearly that that person was deceased. It was the most graphic thing I've ever seen on live news. There is an argument to say that the world, of course, needs to see the realities and the horrors of war, and I'm not complaining about that. But they were saying immediately, this is an Israeli airstrike, this is an Israeli airstrike. And then the BBC parroted that. They put a comma, says Palestinian Health Authority at the end of it to try to qualify it. Humza Yousaf then retweeted that, OK, which appears to endorse this idea that it was an Israeli airstrike. We're seeing the aftermath of that now if you're watching us on TV or online. And now it's turned out that the Israelis are adamant, the Americans are adamant, that this was actually a jihadi rocket from within Gaza that's caused it. It does appear as though Humza Yousaf swallowed the bait on that at the moment. Is that not a concern for people?
Well, in the case of the BBC, it's increasingly compromised. I would argue, and I've said on Twitter and in articles that I've written, I regard the BBC at this point as it's now a question mark whether they have a problem of anti-Semitism in their organisation. This is the BBC that produced a programme just the other day questioning whether the Faraza massacre happened. This is an organisation that has suspended 6 journalists because they've been retweeting and liking and reposting pro-Hamas talking points on social media. So the BBC, which won't call terrorists terrorists, as long as they're Israelis and they're Jews being the victims, the BBC, when the BBC reporting came out in regards to the tragedy of the hospital, when the BBC talked about it, they say they're talking about as Palestinian officials. Well, who's running Gaza? It's Hamas.
Yeah.
Who are the Palestinian officials they're talking
exactly.
about?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, look, obviously, the BBC would deny that that's a problem with anti-Semitism, but I take your point, which is that they have continually caused outrage by some of the aspects of their reporting. Dean, I'm going to leave it there just because we're a bit pressed for time, but thank you very, very much. It's Dean Thompson there. He's a former lecturer and writer for Think Scotland, initially reacting to what Humza Yousaf said, which he's put forward Scotland to be a bastion, a leader, a trailblazer when it comes to a global refugee programme for the people of Gaza. This was followed up almost immediately by Egypt, Jordan and Turkey saying they wouldn't take any refugees from Gaza. That, to me, raises a huge amount of alarm bells. That, to me, is very, very questionable. Is it really the responsibility of Great Britain and Europe to take people from Gaza? Some people would say it is. Some people look at the horrors going on over there and think, we must help. I would argue, why aren't their neighbours doing it? Michael's been in touch in the inbox. Hi, Patrick. We definitely do not want refugees from Gaza. This